Welcome back, everyone. I'm Rather Incoherent. Today we're going to be covering what I think are the 3 strongest staple cards for every class. First though, what do I define a staple card as being? A staple card is simply cards that I'm the most likely to run, the cards that appear in the most decks. I'm not giving a more specific definition than that. You could say that staple cards are role agnostic, their economy and draw and things that are going to go into any deck. And that's sort of true, but I'm not going to be applying that specific criteria. I've just opened up the decks that I've made, I've played, and looked at them and clicked the cards where I'm like, okay, yeah, it's these. These are the cards that go into my deck list first. I sit down to play a rogue, I click in the thick of it, Karen's Oval, easy mark, and then I start working backwards from there explaining why I shouldn't have done that. And in general, that's how my deck building always works. I click all the cards I want, I end up with over 40 cards, and then I start cutting down in like huge swaths until I get down to like 32 to 34, and deck building gets complicated. But these are gonna be the cards that I click on very early on in that process, and that are very likely to stay until the very end of the deck and make it into campaigns. Since I'm defining staple cards as cards that are the most likely to be in a deck, they are going to be more likely to be role agnostic to appear in more decks. They're going to be more likely to be level 0 cards to appear in more decks. They aren't necessarily going to be those things, but it's worth pointing out that the list will obviously be tilted towards those categories. I'm going to do top 3 staple cards for each class, and I'm going to do it in the order of what I view as weakest class to best class. I'm not going to make the argument for why it's that way in this video, I'm just telling you what the order is. And that means we're starting with Guardian. Now, in my top 3, Runic Axe doesn't make it. It needs to be here as an honorable mention to how much space it takes up in videos, but it is my 4th card. The reason it's not in my top 3 is because, well, not everyone's fighting. Carson's not buying this, Carolyn's not buying this. And frankly, it's also replaceable. Sure, it is the best method of fighting, you'll be just fine without Runic Axe. But I did feel the need to mention Runic Axe existing since it takes up so much time in the videos and it's just funny to put it in the list, even as a joke. No, my number 3 staple for Guardians is Take the Initiative. It doesn't make it into every Guardian deck. There are some Guardians that are genuinely safe enough to the Mythos to not need it. There are other Guardians that are so single-mindedly focused on accomplishing a goal, they have a hard time finding room for it. But every Guardian deck I make, Take the Initiative starts off. Most of them, it does not get cut. Take the Initiative is just 3 question marks against the Mythos, not against every Mythos card. Frozen in Fear is the Achilles heel of Guardians because of this timing window that Take the Initiative uses. But it is still just one of the best Mythos mitigation tools for actually passing a test available to Guardians. Most Guardian Mythos mitigation comes in the form of, it's fine, Tetsuo can die instead. And while that is good, it's not the best you can do. Typically, you want to include better alternatives, and in that regard, Take the Initiative is better. That's really all there is to say about Take the Initiative. If you need to pass a Mythos test, Guardian has no better card than Take the Initiative, and it makes it very hard to take this out of many decks. Coming down to my number 2 card for Guardians, it is Stand Together level 0. I would have loved to put Stand Together level 3 here, but the simple fact is that as hard as I try to make myself upgrade this early because I look at the game theory, I'm like, God, it's so much draw. My team is so strong when I upgrade to Stand 3 immediately. Much more likely I'm going to be upgrading to Stand Together level 3 on like the 3rd, 4th, or even 5th scenario. However, Stand Together level 0 is in every Guardian deck I play, because while there are other forms of economy open to Guardians, none of them help your team and none of them net as many total resources as Stand Together. Stand Together is just the best economy card in Guardian, and while I always angle to get Stand Together level 3 as quickly as I can, I am always starting with Stand Together 0. The only way that doesn't happen is if I'm an incredibly selfish character, and Guardian is my off class. Coming down to what I view as the most staple card in Guardian, it is Safeguard. This is so often a slotless Leo DeLuca, just 2 cost for a move action every turn. And sure, your teammates need to coordinate with you for the move action, you need to move the move action, Leo DeLuca can be used to attack. Leo DeLuca is decidedly better, but Safeguard is like 90 to 95% of what Leo will offer will be got by a Safeguard as well. This card is insanely efficient, and while Safeguard 2 is better, allowing you 1, unlimited move actions, and 2, allowing your Seeker to use you as a human shield, just walk into a location with an enemy and they engage you instead, all that interaction is really cool. Safeguard level 2 is such a bells and whistle upgrade. It's a bunch of niche cases where, yeah, if you can get Safeguard 2, you're happy to get it, but it's not a priority upgrade at all, so Safeguard level 0 is in far, far more of my decks than Safeguard level 2 is. Moving on to Survivors, I have to give an honorable mention to Unrelenting. This isn't actually in my top 3, but unlike Runic Axe, it's not like a joke honorable mention where Runic Axe was a distant 4th and maybe shouldn't have been my 4th. Unrelenting is very close to my 3rd place. It's an incredible card. 1 experience to draw 2, basically that's what Unrelenting does. Yes, you're more likely to auto-fail. Yes, your numbers need to be high enough to actually pass the test after making the odds a little bit worse. But still, 1 experience to draw 2 is so good. it's hard to overstate how many decks I have access to Survivor where I'm either looking at Unrelenting immediately or I'm looking at my deck without Unrelenting and I'm like, I could have more draw though. Unrelenting is just some of the best draw in the game. It's very, very hard to cut from a deck because basically it is just fast draw 2. There's a lot more text than that, but that's how it tends to play out. My actual number 3 for Survivor is Lucky level 0. I don't think Lucky level 0 is the third best Survivor card. I think there are so many cards where in their niche they're much better than Lucky. However, Lucky allows you to just take a Mythos test without committing guts a number of times. Sometimes that number of times is once and you immediately use Lucky and this is a 1-cost guts. But because it's retroactive, other times you'll be taking a test up 1, you're like, that's fine, I've got Lucky in hand. And then 4 tests later, your Lucky is still in your hand and you just gotten to get away with so much greed while still being completely consistent in the process. Lucky is a tremendous amount of hidden value, and in addition to that, it's a great form of Mythos mitigation, allowing you to pass a lot of tests you would otherwise fail. Just being retroactive skill test, what's the word for it? Manipulation? I don't know what the phrase for what cards like Lucky do. It adjusts the values of skill tests retroactively. But that type of card is tremendously effective. Lucky's a very good rate for a very strong effect, and it's not that Lucky goes off once. If Lucky went off once, that would not be that good. It's all the times Lucky goes off before you actually have to spend the card that makes Lucky so strong. Lucky's just very, very good, and no other card really replicates what Lucky does. Coming down to my number 2, it is the new Sparrow Mask. This card is absolutely insane. Survivors didn't really struggle with the Mythos phase before, but now Survivors kind of laugh at the Mythos phase. For a 1-cost, basically slotless asset, you get almost unlimited +2 head or +2 foot. Like if you're using the stats proactively, you're not going to be using it on every test. But if you're using this predominantly to fight the Mythos, you know, you're going to probably pass 2 tests because of this, and then you're going to take damage, and the damage you take will refill it, allowing you to pass more tests with it. It's just very, very strong. If you have any synergy with this, like the recently posted Parallel Agnes deck I showed, it's kind of crazy. But just the baseline for a Sparrow Mask is so, so good. It is so much Mythos mitigation. Every character needs Crypt Shield fodder. Your character, over the course of campaigns, will auto-fail a Crypt Shield test, eventually. And when you do, you need a shitty asset on your board you're not too upset to lose. A 1-cost slotless asset is about as low opportunity cost as it can get. And the fact that Sparrow Mask might even not be the discard because it's just that good in spite of how cheap it was is wild. Sparrow Mask is the single best Mythos mitigation card in the game in terms of what a single card does. There are better Mythos mitigation engines like Big Money using Well Connected, for instance, but in terms of what a single card can do, Sparrow Mask is the best bang for your buck in any class, and Mythos mitigation is one of the most important things in the game. There's an argument I should have put it at number 1. I'm talking the card up quite a lot. Survivor has some very, very powerful top-end cards. With how much I've talked up Sparrow Mask, it might be a surprise it's only coming in at number 2. But coming in at number 1 is At a Crossroads. Somebody recently pointed out in the comments that like I run At a Crossroads in every single Survivor deck. It's actually more prolific in my decks than Runic Axe. And I was like, oh yeah, it is. I mean, it should be, it's great. I wouldn't even call At a Crossroads a pet card. I would view cutting At a Crossroads today as like cutting Emergency Cash in the core set. This is just by far one of the best draw cards in the game. For its cost, like it's tied with number 1 with Deep Knowledge probably. In terms of absolute value of a draw card, like there are signatures that are better, there's Cryptic Research. But yeah, this card's absolutely insane. As good as Unrelenting is, At a Crossroads is better. And that might be a slightly contentious statement. At a Crossroads is going to cost you an action, but At a Crossroads can easily be given to your teammates if they need it more than you. Additionally, At a Crossroads is going to, I don't know how to phrase it succinctly, it's not going to affect your outcome on a skill test. You don't have to potentially lower your tempo by lowering your odds of succeeding. So you could argue this is like using Unrelenting and taking a draw action. I would argue it's like a more flexible Unrelenting that doesn't affect my tempo at all. And odds are if I'm putting stuff like Unrelenting in my deck, I am willing to take draw actions. Otherwise, I wouldn't be running all these draw cards. So At a Crossroads being a slightly lower rate for something that's more flexible, I actually appreciate that. Additionally, Unrelenting in the late game can often be kind of irrelevant. The fact that At a Crossroads does give you this alternative to drawing 3 cards. Additionally, At a Crossroads does give you alternatives. In the late game, you can draw an Unrelenting that's not particularly valuable. You don't need the cards. You're going to play it anyway, but it's not incredible. Having this ability to turn At a Crossroads into tempo, or to throw it across the map to somebody who's running out of steam because the Mythos deck wrecked them somehow, I think the cross-map support about a Crossroads and the alternative tempo use of it, which comes up a lot less, let me tell you. But I do think those meaningfully add value to the card to push it pretty far ahead of where Unrelenting is. And I think before At a Crossroads, I played Unrelenting a hell of a lot more. I vastly prefer the way At a Crossroads feels to the way Unrelenting feels. They're both great cards, but I've got to give number 1 to At a Crossroads, whereas I think Unrelenting's far enough back that it's only getting an honorable mention. Now, I said that I was going to order this in terms of the general power level of the classes. And I'm not really sure if number 3 is Rogue or Mystic. They're very close. It sort of depends on how I evaluate power level, because I think the Rogue card pool is better, but the Mystic Investigators as a whole end up doing better than Rogues do. My tier list is telling me otherwise, but I'm going to go to Mystics, and I'm going to start with a placeholder for number 3. This isn't just down the rabbit hole, this is down the rabbit hole, Arcane Research, the second copy of Arcane Research, and the new great work which is coming out in Drowned City. This is every experience permanent getting an honorable mention as 3rd place together. I could have put this as number 1. Essentially, every Mystic is taking experience permanents. Not doing that is just self-grief. It makes your deck better. Figure out how to jump through the hoops, and then you get tons of experience, become vastly more powerful than you otherwise would have. These experience permanents sort of define Mystic. Mystic assets were originally too expensive because of Arcane Research, and then they kept being too expensive until it added up to be the whole deck is too expensive for Arcane Research. At that point, we had more permanents come out to help deal with that. But now every couple of cycles, another permanent needs to come out because you might not have that other cycle that had the extra permanent. And it's just gotten to the point where it's kind of ridiculous the amount of experience Mystics get, and it is a staple part of building any main class Mystic. This is only in 3rd place because any specific card does have a chance to be cut from a certain deck for various reasons. Additionally, off-class Mystics, people who have secondary access to this stuff, are much, much less likely to take it. Coming over to my number 2, it is level 0 Ward of Protection, not level 2. A few years ago, when I was newer to the game, I would definitely have put number 2 on this list over level 0. But as time has gone on, a couple of things have happened. The first thing is that I've just begun to accept that Ancient Evils is not a problem. Ancient Evils sucks, it's terrifying when you're new, and there are certain scenarios that are very hard where that Doom Timer can hurt and be scary. But in the vast majority of scenarios, the Doom Timer was balanced around you drawing Ancient Evils. The devs knew that it was in the deck, and they balanced the Doom Timer accordingly. So when you draw Ancient Evils, it's sort of like you drew nothing, and the clock of the scenario is not being changed. Playing Ward on an Ancient Evils tends to give you time that your team might not necessarily have needed because you weren't expected to cancel the Ancient Evils. Additionally, staying in a scenario for more rounds is more dangerous. The longer you're in a scenario, the more Mythos cards you draw, the more the damage and horror racks up. Being able to stay another round isn't even inherently good. And I talk a lot about Ancient Evil specifically because I think it's the most commonly overestimated Mythos card in terms of its negative effects. However, just in general, as time has went on, not only have I got less scared of the Mythos deck, my teammates have gotten less scared of the Mythos deck, and I have gotten more concerned with upgrading other things. This is all because of the card pool evolving over time. Way back in the day, a rogue would kill for you to use Ward of Protection level 2 on them. But these days, rogues just have enough solutions to it on their own that they don't need you to run Ward like they used to. Additionally, the quality of experience cards in your own deck, like I was mentioning with Down the Rabbit Hole a second ago, there's so many experience cards that are so valuable. First by Ward of Protection level 2 is getting progressively more damaging to your own deck as the opportunity cost rises and rises and rises. Additionally, with all of the trauma dealing cards in the game now, you can start off with 5 Horror Soak if you're running in the thick of it. And if you're doing something like that, then it makes it really scary to take a horror, lose access to your own Ward of Protection, and help your teammate, because now you're sitting at 4 horror and you can't cancel the Rotting Remains that you're about to draw, right? And to be clear, I'm not saying Ward 2 is bad. It's still in my core deck plan for every Mystic deck I make. But there are just so many reasons that upgrading Ward 2 just gets sidelined for a while now. I put Ward in my deck, I'm super happy to use it on myself, and if my teammates wanted it and they can't have it, I'm not too bothered about it. I like playing support characters, but Ward 2 is a sort of support that has just gradually gotten worse every expansion as the opportunity cost has risen and my teammates' needs for it have fallen. Ward 0, however, is still incredible. Being able to take a horror at the cost of a card and a resource is actually pretty bad. Like if you drew a Mythos card and it said, no test, discard a card, take a horror, lose a resource, that card would be fucking wildly out of line. However, being able to use this on tests that are worse is important. If you have 3 damage, 2 foot, and you draw Grasping Hands, you want to play Ward of Protection on that. And there are countless situations like that where, sure, you don't want to play Ward of Protection easily because the actual cost of playing Ward of Protection is fairly high, but you want to hold Ward of Protection for the worst thing the Mythos deck can do to you, because while this effect is on the whole pretty bad, this effect is also just, it's spread out, right? You lose a card, not your hand. You lose a resource, not all of them. You take a horror, you don't die. So when you use it to cancel something that just fully trucks one part of your deck, deals all of your life, discards all your cards, what have you, skips your whole turn, those sorts of cards are much more damaging than the cost of Ward of Protection, and it still ends up going in every Mystic deck. It is, to some degree, there with the intention of getting it to level 2, like around the midway point of a campaign, but it's still very good at level 0, and it's in all of my Mystics because of these things. And my number one card for Mystics is Promise of Power. Take the Initiative is pretty good. It gives you 3 question marks if you do it during the Mythos phase or as your very first action. Promise of Power gives you 4 question marks whenever you want them. It can give it to other people too. It's kind of insane how good Promise of Power is. I mean, sure, you add a curse to the bag, and very rarely you immediately pull the curse and you're running jank Unexpected Courage, and sometimes you'll pull that curse later and it'll cost you a fail. Most of the time that won't happen. Most of the time, Promise of Power says, this test I was scared of, I'm now going to pass. If there was a scenario test that your team was stumped on, Promise of Power solves it. If there was a Mythos test that could have potentially killed somebody, they had like 1 horror left or 2 horror left, and they drew Rotting Remains, they're probably not going to die anymore. I mean, hell, it doesn't even need to be able to kill them, right? They were going to take 3 horror, you give them this, and now on average they take like 0.5 horror, right? Promise of Power is just the one-stop shop to solve scenario test and pass Mythos test. Some of the best team support, one of the best skills, just full stop. Absolute house of a card, nothing bad to say about it. Before I leave for Mystics, I'm going to mention that Delve Too Deep does exist, just not at my table. We house banned it. The gameplay process of it feels terrible. The Mystics just plays all game with a dead card in their hand. Then if any random event discards it, like they lost something they didn't care about, yeah, but the whole table loses an experience, that feels bad. Then at the end of the scenario, rather than winning, we have to sit there and go through a 1 to 2 extra Mythos phases to get our bonus experience. The whole play pattern of Delve Too Deep felt terrible, and then on top of that, we found that in campaigns where we were getting good Delve Too Deep value, we also found the second half of every campaign was trivialized. We turned to every campaign's difficulty curve and it Innsmouth's difficulty curve, because if you show up to scenario 5 with a bonus like 6 experience on everyone, that's sort of like what scenario 5 was meant to give you. You're notably ahead of power curve where you should be. We don't like the way this affects game balance or gameplay patterns. We banned it for those reasons. However, if we hadn't, it would probably still be on the list somewhere. I don't know that it would, because I value scenario 1 strength so highly that maybe as a player, I no longer even think Delve Too Deep is good. I've had that realization, like maybe we don't need to ban Delve Too Deep anymore. If our table, like all of us agree at this point that scenario 1's more important than scenario 5 by a landslide. So maybe making your scenario 1 worse to be better in the late game is not even that broken. I genuinely don't know that Delve Too Deep is that strong anymore, but it is banned at my table, so I don't know how much of a staple it should be. Which leaves Lucius Galloway's colors on the table, Seeker and Rogue. And I think it's become a point of contention whether or not Rogues or Seekers have the better card pool. I think it's really hard to evaluate the answer to that because card pool is not a clear thing, where card pool does include the Investigator cards, right? And I think generally speaking, a lot of Rogue Investigator cards are just kind of bad. Because Seeker Investigators tend to be so much better, that's part of why I think the Seeker card pool is better and it works my decision making a lot. Additionally, I don't know if I think the Rogue card pool is good so much as like specific Rogue archetypes and Rogue packages. The general card quality maybe. I don't know. I'm torn on whether or not Rogue or Seeker are the better card pool. Because I can see the argument that Rogue has gotten better. Because the Seeker cards feel insane and Investigators are already obviously good. The Rogue card pool is doing so much heavy lifting to make it look like Vanilla Skid's is a playable character. I'm still not sold on the idea that the Seeker card pool has been dethroned and isn't still number 1. I'm saying that Rogue is the second strongest card pool and I'm putting them next. Quick Thinking is not my number 3 though, it is my honorable mention. Because Quick Thinking does make it into a ton of Rogue decks, it is something I often start with and frequently cut, especially in big money decks going for Chaos. However, Quick Thinking is a card that is just, it suffers from being in the Rogue class. There are a lot of Rogues that have a hard time guaranteeing a pass by 2. Obviously, there are solutions to this. If you are a Flex or a Cleaver, you have lockpicks. But because Quick Thinking doesn't really get into a deck on its own very frequently, you show up, you're playing Skids, you look at Quick Thinking, you're like, man, I'd love to pass by 2. But I'm main fighter and that fist number is 3, and I don't know if that's actually going to happen. If Quick Thinking were in any other class, maybe not Survivor, However, in Rogue specifically, it just gets an honorable mention because very frequently quick thinking is talked about as though you have lockpicks in play, but it's not that simple. Lockpicks doesn't go in every deck, and there are a lot of rogues that really struggle to get quick thinking to perform at the level it does in the best rogues. Which is a pretty weird thing to say when my number 3 is Lucky Cigarette Case, but if I'm going to be trying to succeed by 2, one action is worth a lot less than drawing a card every time I can manage to do it. Obviously once a turn. But Lucky Cigarette Case is one of the best draw cards in the game. With quick thinking, I'm keeping it in my hand until I can finally use it and then I get my one action. But with Lucky Cigarette Case, I'm keeping it in my hand until I can finally use it, at which point it's going to be going off recursively, hopefully. And it's much more likely to go off recursively because it's drawing the things that might be skill cards to fuel it to go off again. Additionally, quick thinking needs you to succeed by 2 on a specific test. Lucky Cigarette Case just needs you to succeed by 2 at some point. So quick thinking requires you to be up 4 realistically, and then you still have a good chance of not getting it. Lucky Cigarette Case, if you're just taking your test up 2 and you're taking 2 to 3 tests a turn, will probably go off during that turn, at least half the time. It's just much easier to accomplish succeed by 2 at some point during your turn than on a specific skill test, at least with most rogue investigators outside of lockpicks. And if we are considering lockpicks, then Lucky Cigarette Case is by far the better card. I was having a hard time articulating why Lucky Cigarette Case wasn't higher on this list. I opened 8 of my most recent rogue decks just now. Except for pure vanilla Skids, who is doing everything he can to pump fist and does not have time for a cigarette case. Every single one of them ran cigarette case, so why is it my number 3? Because every single one of them also ran the next 2 cards. There's a package of rogue cards that are very, very common. Karen's Opal might deserve an honorable mention. I don't actually view that as a staple. I'm just a greedy idiot who never gets punished for playing it, so I keep doing it. But Lucky Cigarette Case is incredibly staple. As far as the number 3 cards in each list go, Lucky Cigarette Case is as common as the number 1 card in most of these other lists. But so is Faustian Bargain, my number 2. And while as I might conceivably find myself in a deck where my accessory slot is contested, or I'm strapped for setup time already, or I have off-class access to draw and somehow don't want to deal with Lucky Cigarette Case, I can come up with reasons I might not run Cigarette Case. I can't come up with a single reason not to run Faustian Bargain. It is in every rogue deck I make. The only exception I've ever had is a late game Preston deck where I cut Faustian Bargain for Hot Streak because I was doubling it all the time, so I'd rather not flood the bag with curses. Faustian Bargain goes into basically every rogue deck because it is just the best economy card in the game. And yes, 2 curse tokens is a meaningful downside, but the ability to share these resources to your team is a meaningful upside. Very frequently, what I'll see Faustian Bargain actually does is the person playing it takes 3 of the resources and their teammates each take 1, and then we find ourselves in a situation where we essentially paid 2 curse tokens to save ourselves 2 resource actions. And that is much, much more obviously good than getting the resources as a value, because we were in situations during setup where we were going to have to take resource actions were it not for the Faustian Bargain as a support mechanism. Faustian Bargain's just incredibly good. And while I said that typically I will not be covering that many experience cards in this list, Easy Mark is one experience in a post In the Thick of It world. If I were covering neutral cards, I am not. In the Thick of It would have been my number 1 card for that because it just goes in almost every deck. Mark doesn't want it, Mystics might not want it, everyone else, they want to figure out what it does. Because so often, it's hard to find a way to justify in a rogue not taking In the Thick of It, because 3 copies of Easy Mark improves your deck tremendously. They're cantrips, they replace themselves, they give you resources, you're a rogue, you needed those. Even if you're not big money, your cards are just expensive and you need the economy. Easy Mark is technically more common in my starting decks than Faustian Bargain, because there are 3 of them instead of 2. I could have put the list basically in any order for rogue. All 3 of these cards are very nearly ubiquitous in my rogue decks. Every single rogue starts their deck by clicking Karen's Opal, In the Thick of It, Easy Mark, Faustian Bargain, Lucky Cigarette Case, Quick Thinking. And then usually Quick Thinking might not make it to the end of the list. That one's 50-50. But most of the rest of that will be staying in the list when I get to my final deck. And to be clear, when I'm talking on Easy Mark, I'm not talking about playing multiples. I pretend this line isn't here, because waiting to draw a second Easy Mark is very often a trick. You can do that. If your economy is good, you don't need to play Easy Mark right now, then fine, go ahead and take your draw action and greet. But very frequently, the right thing to do is just play Easy Mark with only 1 copy in your hand. It's e-cash, but you've swapped out a resource for a draw, and that's just better, right? E-cash is gain 3 resources. If there were a neutral card that said draw 3 cards, I mean, that's a Seeker card that puts curses in the bag, right? That would be insane. Playing a single easy mark is very good. Playing 2 easy marks when you actually have a double or even triple easy mark opening, you're basically set to win the game. I cannot overstate how powerful easy mark is when you actually trigger the reaction on it. It's great without it. You do not need the reaction. The reaction just snaps the game in half. Which brings us to, in my opinion, the strongest class, Seekers. And Shortcut is an honorable mention. It is not in my top 3. My dog walked into the office and told me he needed to go for a walk, and I've lost my train of thought. I believe I'd only just introduced Shortcut as the honorable mention for Seekers, and Shortcut is very, very good. It converts a card into an action, essentially. That's just generally good tempo and a solid card. Because Seekers have such an abundance of draw, they can very easily afford to pay for that effect. The reason Shortcut's not higher is because Shortcut's very frequently cut for things like Pathfinder and things like Eon Chart. There's other ways of recursively causing this effect to happen in Seekers, and not that many Seekers are high enough draw that they can be like, oh, I'll Shortcut every turn. I'll just cast Shortcut this turn, and I'll use the next Shortcut next turn, and on the 3rd turn, I'll shuffle my deck and I'll draw the Shortcuts back and we'll do it again. That's the insane top end that Shortcut has that very few characters achieve, but because of that, it's worth an honorable mention where there are several characters that genuinely just don't want to cut Shortcut. They're happy to never remove the card from their deck. They don't want to spend experience on Pathfinder. They don't want to take the play action. They just want to draw it again. Additionally, Shortcut has a lot of hidden power. Normally, you just cannot move people outside of their turn. Using Shortcut on someone else gives them an action, essentially. The most common way this will show up is your Clover, because you're a Seeker, and you have Shortcut in your hand, the ball spawns in the next room over, and you Shortcut your Guardian in, or your Rogue Fighter, whatever it is, and that gives them an extra action to fight the boss with. The ability to use this on other people and essentially give bonus actions to your main fighter is the reason this card's a lot more powerful than it might seem on the surface, but it is very good, and it shows up in quite a lot of decks, make no mistake. It's just it frequently gets cut. Deduction level 0 also technically gets cut very frequently, so maybe I should have put deduction level 2 here, or maybe there's an argument that neither deduction should be here, Shortcut should be here, and deduction should be the honorable mention because like half my decks have deduction, half my decks have deduction 2, and on the whole, neither are as common as they should be. However, I think it's inaccurate to say that deduction doesn't deserve to be here. Deduction 2 was very frequently delayed until roughly the midpoint of a campaign, as so many Seekers have some sort of core thing they want. Harvey Walters is looking for Bulletproof Vest, Farsight, Mike and its Occult Lexicon. There are a lot of things that Harvey Walters might want if he's playing Farsight Flex. If he's playing a different deck, he'll likely have some sort of synergy package he wants there. Daisy wants Abigail Foreman, Kate wants the Clue Dropper package, Ursula wants all the movement tech. Every Seeker wants something, so very few Seekers get Deduction level 2 super early on. And I think Deduction level 0 has a greater impact on how decks get played and what goes into a deck than Deduction level 2 has. Deduction level 2 is very nearly the same amount of common. I'm sort of lumping them together in one card at number 3 and not placing them any higher for 1, it's not really one card, so it sort of splits how common they are, and 2, not all Seekers are playing main Clover. I mean, almost all of them are playing at least Flex. Like there's Fighter Joe and that's kind of it. You can play main Fighter Harvey as a meme, but I wouldn't recommend it. Same with Amanda. Most of the staple list is decidedly role agnostic. It's why I joked about Runic Axe at the start of the list. However, basically every Seeker is actually a Clover or a Flex Clover that wants to flex with Deduction. Deduction's just stupidly strong and efficient, level 0 or level 2. This is sort of a stand-in for either of them. If there were more non-Clover Seekers, Deduction wouldn't make this list, but there kind of just aren't. A card that I never want to cut from any list is my number 2 for Seeker, Crack the Case. Crack the Case is usually, in its worst case scenario, fast e-cash. I'll always talk about the problems of economy later. You want your economy freely available on turn 1. However, Crack the Case and Seeker's like, oh yeah, you'll have to get through your starting location without the emergency cash. That sounds really difficult. Crack the Case is just in a class where the criteria for economy later is something you'll accomplish by turn 2 in almost every scenario. If you draw other economy cards, you can frequently hold Crack the Case to get more than 3 resources with it. Its most powerful side effect is that this functions the same way Faustian Bargain does, where you can take 3 of the resources for yourself and give 1 to a teammate. You can take 1 resource for yourself and give 2 to your teammates. It's just the team support of being able to save other players' resource actions by just chipping away at your own economy in negligible ways is really, really valuable, especially in a class that tends to build as cheap decks as Seeker often does. Crack the Case is just one of the best economy cards in the game, one of the few things that would compete with Faustian Bargain in a top 10 economy cards list for number 1. It's just very, very good. It's also notable that Crack the Case is role agnostic, unlike Burning the Midnight Oil. You can run Crack the Case in any fighter, and they just play it when the Kluber finishes the location, right? Burning the Midnight Oil is substantially harder to get use out of if you're not trying to investigate with Book, and that's why I have Crack the Case here, and Burning the Midnight Oil would be like another shortcut to your honorable mention, entirely because it's so dedicated to finding clues and also needing enough economy cards that Crack the Case makes the cut. Sorry, that Crack the Case isn't enough. That you're playing a deck where you need a more economy than what Crack the Case can offer, but you're also not playing a deck where you're trying to run cryptic writings. Burning the Midnight Oil is just a little bit more niche, not very niche. I'm not pretending it's actually niche, but it's more niche than Crack the Case. And the most generally useful secret card, you all saw this coming, it's Deep Knowledge. Deep Knowledge is 0 cost, draw 3. I mean, sure, that's curses to the bag, that's not free. And yeah, technically it's a support card, but you can split up the cards to your team. Typically, the way Deep Knowledge gets played is you either dump 3 cards into yourself because you're the Seeker and you matter the most, or you dump 3 cards into your fighter because he has not drawn his weapon, and that's a serious problem. Deep Knowledge is like directly on par with At a Crossroads in my mind. It's technically better if you're the Kluber, if you're the one who progresses the game the most, to have At a Crossroads, because that means that if you use it for team support, you're not the one who loses the action. And 1 experience is oftentimes less of a downside than 2 curse tokens. However, Deep Knowledge and At a Crossroads are not mutually exclusive, and typically if I have access to both, I run both. Deep Knowledge is just some of the most efficient draw in the game, and nothing else really comes close besides At a Crossroads and, well, Cryptic Research, but it's a 4 XP card, it better fucking come close. Deep Knowledge is just one of the most efficient draw cards in the game. When I think of the best draw cards in the game, it's Deep Knowledge, it's At a Crossroads. And then when I think harder, I'm like Lucky Cigarette Case, Cryptic Research, and then 5 is sort of a power gap where it's not on the same tier as the rest of this. It's probably unrelenting. Not as big of a power gap as I thought. But Deep Knowledge is just such an efficient draw card. Going 3 cards deep into your deck is a massive amount of consistency. It's a net +2 to hand size, which again, just like, there are not really cards doing more than that. The previous version of Deep Knowledge, Posture Sketches, cost 2 resources and had conditions on when it could be played, conditions you oftentimes would find yourself like you could meet them, but it would require you to play it a little bit later, a little bit jankier. It feels weird to end on Deep Knowledge, because Deep Knowledge is a card where I have nothing else to say about it, where it's just obviously transparently good. It's something that every deck needs. Draw is just such a premium effect. There are simply not that many draw cards in the game, and every deck needs draw. You need to draw the thing your deck does. You need to draw the way your deck pays for it. You need to draw your draw cards that are looking for that thing. Every deck wants draw, and Deep Knowledge is one of the best rates for draw in the game. And there's really not much more to say about it than that. These are what I feel are the most commonly played cards, at least at my table in every class. If you have things you think I'm overlooking, or the cards you think I'm grossly overestimating, I'd love to hear. If you did make it this far, then please do hit all the buttons to make the algorithm happy. And a heartfelt thank you to everyone supporting this channel, both as patrons over on Patreon and channel members here on YouTube. I'll see all of you in the next one.